Hello and welcome to my video all about how to knit the loop stitch. As you can see from this sample here, on the last right side row I did a full row of loop stitches. On the right side rows underneath that, I only did the loop stitch every other stitch. So as you can see, that produced a much more sparse look. For the first stitch on this row, I'm going to do a knit stitch. You can do a loop stitch on the edges, but I find that they often wrap round to the back and look a bit messy. So I just do a normal knit stitch to start. So for the loop stitch, you take your right hand needle up through the top stitch as if to knit like normal. You then do all the usual steps of a knit stitch until you get to the point where you would normally push the stitch off the top of the left hand needle. At this point I position my needles parallel to each other with a small gap in between. Then I take the working yarn from the back to the front. I then put my thumb of my left hand on top of that working yarn. I then wrap the yarn around my thumb by taking it over my thumb and then back through between the needles. I tend to make sure this yarn is quite tight around my thumb so that it won't fall off. We now need to knit this top stitch on the left hand needle again. So we take the right hand needle up through that stitch and do a normal knit stitch. This time pushing the stitch off the top of the needle. You can keep your thumb inside the loop of yarn to make sure that it stays the right size. However, I find that this makes the next step quite awkward. So at this point I drop the yarn from my thumb. I then use my left hand needle to pick up the second stitch down on the right hand needle, take it over the stitch above it, and then drop it off the end of the needle. The reason we have to do this is because we've created 2 stitches from 1, but we don't want to increase the overall number of stitches, so we need to reduce those 2 stitches down to 1, and this step also fixes the loop stitch in place. And now I repeat that. So I go into the next stitch and do all the steps of a normal knit stitch, except the part where I push that stitch off the end of the needle. I then bring the working yarn to the front between the needles, put my thumb on top, take the yarn back over my thumb and to the back of the needles again, and make sure my thumb is wrapped quite tightly. Bear in mind that if you want to change the size of the loop at all, then now is the time to do it. All you need to do is just loosen or tighten the loop. Then I knit the top stitch on the left hand needle again. So I go up through that stitch and complete a knit stitch. Then I drop the loop from my thumb. Then I use the left hand needle to pick up the second stitch down, take it over the top stitch and drop it off the end of the needle. And that completes the second loop stitch. And I carry on like this across the row. So I do an almost complete knit stitch, bring the yarn to the front, wrap it around my thumb and back again, do another knit stitch, and then pick up the second stitch down and take it over the stitch above, and so on. Then for the very last stitch I just do a normal knit stitch. You can see where I've done a loop stitch at the edge of the knitting here, and I think that it looks a bit messy because it tends to wrap around to the back of the knitting. On the next row you have a few options. You can do either a normal knit stitch row or a purl stitch row, or you could do another row of loop stitches if you wanted the knitting to be reversible. In my opinion, a loop stitch looks a lot better if you do it every stitch rather than every other stitch. This is particularly true on thinner yarns, as demonstrated here. The top row is where I've done a loop stitch on every stitch, and underneath that I've done particularly small loop stitches by either wrapping the working yarn around a cable needle rather than my thumb, or by simply tightening the loops. And I made these every other stitch. And then on the bottom row I did the normal thumb method every other stitch. And as you can see, they look quite straggly and quite sparse. I much prefer the loop stitches when they're either smaller or I do them on every stitch. And then on the back you can see that for one row I did the loop stitches on both the front and the back, just to show you that that's also an option. And that's it, that's how you knit the loop stitch. I really hope you found this helpful, and thank you very much for watching.